Hello, my name is Kristianne and I'm autistic. I'm also non-binary, which means I use they, them pronouns. And I'm going to talk today about the positives of being diagnosed autistic later in life. Because my brain doesn't work in the same way as a neurotypical brain, I often find myself asking why. Why do we do this? Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to do it that way? Why can't we do it another way? Because in my brain, I've already seen another way. People say to me, you're brilliant at finding solutions to problems, but I don't think I am. It's just the way that I see the world is different. So I approach problems in a different way. And often my solutions are simplistic in their practical approach to solving, and so don't necessarily always see the human impact they might have. But I'm an excellent manager of people because I nurture and support people to grow and develop since I can see their potential. There is a common misconception that autistic people don't have empathy, and this isn't true. Many of us struggle with cognitive empathy, although we can learn this, but for most of us, we have huge amounts of affective empathy, which is also called compassionate and emotional empathy. And this means that when we understand someone has a problem that's causing them distress or upset, we're really able to support them. We have to overcome the barrier of cognitive empathy to get there, though. Having said this, it can mean we become very overwhelmed or emotional about things that for neurotypical people aren't normally an issue, just because we feel the emotions of others more intensely. I see this as a positive. Because my brain works differently, it also means I have a better understanding and acceptance of who I am. I've been able to accept that I'm a non-binary person. That is, I don't see myself as either female or male. I don't feel that because of my biology, I have to be female and ascribe to everything that Western culture and society assigns to people whose bodies resemble mine. I've always known this about myself, but I didn't have the right language to describe it until a few years ago. It also means that I understand my sexual preferences and can openly accept them. And a really high proportion of autistic people are non-gender conforming and not heterosexual. Not all of us, of course, but per head of population, we have a higher percentage than neurotypical people do. Because I don't look autistic and my general life profile doesn't fit as that of an autistic person, I feel like I can be a really good advocate for autism and autistic people. I've been able to share my journey since my diagnosis in a blog and on social media. And many people that I've known for years have told me that they are also autistic, and seeing me being open and out about it has helped them to share it with people, sometimes for the first time since their diagnosis. For me, being autistic is my superpower. Others have said that other traits I have are my superpower because they see them as exceptional in an ordinary world. But I do struggle with being that modest about things. All my life, I found it difficult to fit in. I tried, but I always ended up being me again and exhausted from the effort it took to fit in. Imagine being 10 years old and trying desperately to like horses and ponies because that's what all the other kids were into. Or feeling a closer affinity with all things boy-like because society had deemed that you were a female, but you weren't drawn to those things and it didn't always feel right. I have spent time thinking about how different my life had been had I had a diagnosis as a child or teenager. And whilst I think there may have been some pros to it, on the whole, I'm much happier with my adult diagnosis. I was diagnosed aged 47, which was now 5-6 years ago. My assessor at the time said that they were absolutely certain of my diagnosis, having done this for over 30 years, and that it was very clear to them. And I won't lie, this was a bit of a shock to me. I hadn't honestly thought until that point that autism and me were a thing. What I did have was a very media-formed idea of what autism looked like. A child lying on the floor banging their fists, or a quiet, withdrawn adult male who was a math or music savant. Of course, I now know that that is not true because I'm rubbish at maths and I barely play an instrument. My diagnosis in some ways freed me. It released me from the perpetual cycle of having to be like the others to fit in. It told me that my difference wasn't a bad thing, but simply different. and that actually it was other people's lack of acceptance that was problematic. Autistic people, even those who aren't diagnosed, mask. And I know this because I masked all my life, even before I had my diagnosis. And masking is a term for trying to emulate behaviour that is considered acceptable by neurotypicals. It usually means hiding who we really are and suppressing stims or other coping mechanisms. And it is highly controversial in the adult autistic community. Many people believe we shouldn't have to do it, and many believe it's the only way to stay safe in a neurotypical world. And some definitely do it better than others. And I think I was managing it to some extent, although when I did share my diagnosis with people, many people said it just didn't surprise them. I know people who I'm close to want me to be my real self and mask, but it doesn't really feel safe for me not to do it at all. And someone eventually always gets upset or offended because I've done or said the wrong thing. But now I tell people when I meet them, either at the beginning, the first time I meet them, or the beginning of a meeting or whatever, that I am autistic. I don't do this by way of an apology or an explanation, but to let them know that they might need to make some reasonable adjustment in their expectations whilst they're with me. And I think it's helped a lot. Another great thing about my adult diagnosis was no longer feeling that the need that I had to hide my stims. I didn't know when I was growing up what these compulsions were, and I always hid them from the world. And I'd sit on my hands in public spaces or at meetings so that I didn't do them. Or if I did do them, I found myself doing them, I'd dig my fingernails into my palms to stop me doing it. And I guess that's a grounding mechanism in itself. But I've discovered other ways of stimming as well, which is really helpful. And I'm not at all bothered now if I need to stim, I just do it. I know I've seen people stare and point at me when I'm doing it, but I'm not bothered. It's not their fault that they're neurotypical and they don't understand. I've spent some time, but not too much, wondering how different life might have been had I been diagnosed when I was younger. And now I know what the signs are. I know that they were there. And I've come to the conclusion that diagnosis in childhood isn't necessarily a good thing. I've spoken to people who were diagnosed as children, and the consensus seems to be that whilst they got some extra support, it almost stifled them. People made assumptions about their ability based on their diagnosis. And so there were times when they couldn't do the things that they wanted to do because they're autistic. And the people responsible for them made decisions to keep them safe. And I know that I would have found that much, much harder than not knowing and having to deal with some of the trauma that I've had to deal with in my life. And now I know I'm autistic, I can make decisions and choices about my life with the knowledge of what does and doesn't work for me. And as a child, I wouldn't have had that autonomy, even with a diagnosis. And I know that I would have found that difficult. I've also discovered that I have some co-occurring conditions that sit alongside my autism. I have rapid mood cycling, depression, anxiety, CPTSD, dyspraxia, and I'm currently waiting formal diagnosis for ADHD. But if I hadn't had my autism diagnosis, I wouldn't have been able to discover and separate out each of these other elements. And knowing all this means I can deal with each one appropriately instead of thinking that I have one really big issue, which is overcomplicated. And if I can keep my sensory overload to a minimum, it won't have as much of a knock-on effect on my other conditions because they do all coexist side by side. And this has meant that I've been able to manage my well-being much more efficiently and maintain a much better life balance. I know my well-being and mental health has been in a much, much better place since getting my diagnosis as an adult. I don't think I have autism. I am autistic. Being autistic isn't my whole, but it is a part of who I am. It affects how I respond to and deal with life. But I've learned that if you make a space autism friendly, then it's a better place for everyone.